Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Sean Huggins and this is Europe with Hugs. Thank you so much for being here. We got some crazy news headlines coming out of America every single day. And today we're taking a look at the trade war that is happening between America and the entire world, but really America versus Europe for the purposes of this video. Specifically, can Europe beat Trump? Should the EU use its trade bazooka against Trump? I don't know what a trade bazooka is, but I like the sound of it. It sounds cool. It sounds like something that should be added to Fortnite. Anyways, link to the original video down in the description. As always, let's waste no more time yapping and let's just hop straight into it.
When Trump tariffed all of America's trading partners on Liberation Day, he said it was about reciprocity. In other words, he was only imposing tariffs as big as the ones that other tariffs had already imposed on the US. Now, this was always implausible. After all, the 20% tariff he slapped on the EU was way above the 2% average tariff the EU has on US imports. And it looks like the rates were actually calculated using bilateral trade data.
And ChatGPT.
Not other countries' tariff rates. Nonetheless, this is why on Monday the EU offered to drop all tariffs on cars and industrial goods, hoping that, in the spirit of reciprocity, Trump might do the same. Unfortunately, Trump wasn't convinced, and in a White House press round, he said it wasn't good enough because, quote, the EU was formed to really do damage to the United States in trade. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at how Trump's tariffs will affect the European economy, and how the EU will respond, given a zero-tariff trade deal doesn't seem on the cards.
Let's see.
So, let's start by looking at how the tariffs will affect the EU. Now, admittedly, a lot is still unclear, and fully understanding or quantifying the impact of this tariff tsunami is difficult at the moment. With that being said, there's a pretty clear consensus that this will do some short-term harm to the wider European economy. In general, Europe exports a lot of stuff to the US, and Trump's 20% tariff will mean less demand.
Well, 20% of the EU's exports go to the United States. That is obviously a very large amount.
And for these goods, which makes up around 2% of the EU's GDP. Oh, wow. And in the short term, the EU's GDP will likely contract by 0.3%, according to the ING. No other country can really replace the US in this respect. Americans consume more stuff than basically anyone else, and the uncertainty created by Trump's trade wars will probably dampen consumer demand elsewhere. We should also mention that the effect of these tariffs will vary across each member state, depending on its bilateral trade with the US. In general, you should expect European countries that run the biggest trade surplus, like Ireland, Germany and Italy, to be hit hardest.
Ooh, Deutschland, the motherland of my wife? Oh boy.
While countries like France, Spain and Belgium, with which the US runs surpluses or small deficits, i.e. the US imports more from them than it exports, should be less affected.
Okay.
On the other hand, surplus countries like Germany should count themselves lucky Trump applied a single tax to the entire EU, because if he'd calculated individual rates for each European country using the same method, they would have been hit with higher rates.
But that would involve actually thinking. And that is something that is very difficult to do when you're in the US government.
Germany, for instance, would have been hit with a 26% tariff, while Ireland would have been hit with an eye-watering 42% tariff. There were also a handful of products which have been temporarily exempted from Trump's tariffs, like pharmaceuticals, meaning countries like Ireland, which exports 58 billion euros worth of pharmaceuticals and chemicals to the US every year, will actually have an effective tariff rate far below 20%, assuming these exemptions are sustained. Vice versa, Trump introduced a handful of additional tariffs earlier in the year on European steel, aluminium and automotives, which means manufacturing heavy economies like Slovakia will face extra tariffs at an effective rate well above 20%.
Dang.
Anyways, putting individual countries aside for now, Trump's trade wars will also exacerbate anxieties about Europe's deindustrialization, given that a large fraction of these exports are industry adjacent, and that Trump's 54% tariff on China risks inviting a flood of Chinese exports.
Of course. I mean, everyone's thinking about this now. China is frothing at the mouth. They're like, yes, get us in the European Union even more. Why not?
As Chinese businesses that are now effectively unable to sell to the US market redirect their goods into Europe, pushing prices down further, putting more strain on their European competitors. The silver lining here is that a flood of cheap Chinese goods could bring down prices for European consumers and offset some of the inflation that might be incurred by tariff-related disruptions to supply chains. This puts the EU in somewhat of a stronger position than the US, where inflation is being compounded by tariffs-related disruption, a weak dollar, and more expensive imports. This is why, after a meeting in Luxembourg earlier this week, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that Europe is always ready for a good deal, and, to stave off a trade war, offered Trump a 0-for-0 tariff deal for industrial goods. However, negotiating with Washington looks pretty futile. Earlier this week, Trump stated he's not interested in any talks unless the EU pays the US a lot of money on a yearly basis.
What the frick? I mean, what? Not interested unless you pay a lot of money. You gotta pay a lot of money on a yearly basis. A lot of people tell me it's a great deal. Some people say it's the best deal. Some people say it's the best deal in history. You gotta pay a lot of money every year on a yearly basis. What does that even mean, dude?
And then, on Monday afternoon, he said a 0-for-0 deal was off the table. Instead, it looks likely the EU will have to agree on a set of targeted retaliatory measures. Broadly speaking, the EU can decide to either impose tariffs on services or on goods. And the way we see it, it will probably be best if the EU's retaliatory measures were focused on services rather than goods.
Interesting.
This is because tariffs on token goods like Levi jeans or Harley-Davidson motorbikes, which is what the EU has gone for in the past, are only so effective. The Commission is currently considering tariffs of up to 25% on a broad range of US goods, including soybeans, almonds, and plastic goods. But this isn't going to stress the White House out too much. Things have been made much more difficult for the Commission here because individual member states have been lobbying for exemptions. France, for instance, has resisted measures against bourbon whiskey, whilst Ireland has asked for dairy duties to be dropped. Focusing on services might thus be more effective. Not least because while the US runs a trade deficit in goods with the EU, it actually runs a trade surplus when it comes to services.
Interesting.
Which means the EU has more leverage in a services-based trade war. The EU would thus probably be better off cracking down on American tech.
So is this the EU trade bazooka? Tariff the services?
Tech companies, which is something Trump clearly doesn't like, or excluding American firms, including consultancies, banks and law firms, from government contracts. This could be done via the EU's new and as of yet unused anti-coercion instrument, dubbed the Trade Bazooka, which provides legal grounds for the EU to respond asymmetrically to economic coercion. But whilst the Trade Bazooka weapon sounds pretty effective, it requires the support of a qualified majority in the EU Council, meaning 55% of EU countries representing at least 65% of the total EU population. Whilst both France and Germany have expressed support for using the ACI, other countries worry this could just escalate the trade war and ultimately do more damage to their economies. Politico reported earlier this week that when the EU trade chief Maroš Šefčovič did a straw poll, only a handful of EU ministers were in favour of the idea, with states like Ireland and Italy, whose pharmaceutical and wine sectors are very much at risk, resisting most vocally. Ultimately, this looks to be yet another test of the EU's cohesion, and Europeans should hope the bloc can come to a consensus on its response, or risk being bullied into a bad deal by Trump.
All right. Wow. Interesting. A lot to think about. I wish that I had the answers, but of course, I'm just a dumb, fat, stupid, uneducated American and a YouTuber at that. So what the heck do I know about frickin' trade wars? Literally nothing. Literally nothing. I'm about 8 minutes into this video. That's how much I know about trade wars. So I don't got the answers, but maybe you guys do. I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you think the EU should do? How do we move forward from here? I'm curious what you guys have to say about it. So let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But that's all the time that I have for today. So thank you guys so much for being here. And as always, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.